Max, here we are in the middle of spring football, getting into the practice time of the year, and there's no better time to talk about soft tissue injury prevention. The last thing any player wants is to be sidelined with the season approaching. Here to talk about that very subject, Dr. Robert Berry, orthopedic surgeon, on the medical staff of Baylor Scott and White Medical in Plano, and the medical director of sports medicine. Dr. Berry, how are you?
I'm great. Glad to be here today.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. Soft tissue injury prevention is something, we've heard a lot more about in football the past couple of years. I know that I really first started hearing about it when now Texas coach Tom Herman was at Houston, and he talked about how he required his players to carry water around and everywhere they went. So let's start with the basics. When we talk about soft tissues and soft tissue injuries, what really are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, one of the most basic things that we deal with as orthopedic surgeons and sports medicine specialists are soft tissues. And, let's face it, the soft tissues, certainly the muscles that move our joints and allow us to do what we do and athletes to perform at high levels, we've got to keep those healthy. If the muscles, the soft tissues are not moving the joints, or in the case of ligaments, stabilizing the joint, then athletes can't do what they do.
And so you would say that really, when we talk about why they're so vital to athletic success, I mean, really, these are kind of the engines of the body. Obviously, you want to keep everything healthy, but from a mobility and kind of flexibility and durability standpoint, it seems like soft tissues are arguably the most important part to keep healthy.
Absolutely. In business, we talk about the mantra of no money, no mission. And then when it talks about sports medicine, we talk about no muscle, no movement.
Mm-hmm.
And that if those muscles, and I'll kind of focus on that. Certainly we can talk on tendons and ligaments, but, dealing with professional athletes my whole career, dealing with soft tissue strains, muscle strains, and that really is what will sideline many athletes and, take them out. I remember years ago, my good friend and colleague, Walt Lowe, who's head team physician for the Houston Texans, dealing with Arian Foster, and I think we all recall the multiple strains and hamstring injuries, and that's one of the most common things that we see. And what ends up happening oftentimes is that we either don't maintain appropriate hydration in the training, we don't necessarily have balanced training with respect to weight training, resistance training, and get muscle imbalance. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I see. So when we talk about at this time of the year, and as we're going to get hotter here in North Texas, we talk about the hydration, which is so important. I think all of us kind of remember the old Bear Bryant days of, practicing hard in the heat, and that, you'll get water when you're done. And now that's exactly the opposite. Plenty of research out there to say that we need to keep our athletes hydrated on the field, and if they get dehydrated, they're at greater risk for injuries. In fact, one of the first stages of heat illness is actually cramping, and where our muscles start to get tight, of course, inhibits our athletic performance. And so when I was with the Chargers, one of the things you'd always see the athletic trainers doing on the field is like making sure you're drinking. In fact, got in trouble if you weren't hydrating appropriately. And usually identifying those athletes on your team, whether it be football, lacrosse, or anything, I'm using football as an example, that you need to be taking in electrolytes if you are performing at a high level over an extended period of time. And everybody's different. And sometimes people are identified as what we call salty sweaters, and those are people that are losing their electrolytes. And that is what can certainly put athletes at risk for not only heat illness, but of course then for cramping. And then when that happens, then you can get secondary muscular strains. So that's one thing I think is really important. I talked about the training. One of the things that I think is very important is training, because prevention is key. If you don't ever have to see me as an orthopedic sports medicine specialist, that's a good day. And, one of the things we used to say is if we could just be on the sidelines at an NFL game and just have a great seat for the game, that's great. But unfortunately, athletes get hurt, football players get hurt, and so often they're soft tissue injuries. And when we go back to the beginning of what can we do as sports medicine specialists, coaches, athletic trainers to prevent these things? Well, I'll go back to talking about training. Dealing with people like LaDainian Tomlinson, Drew Brees, if you were to look at what their training regimens were like, it'd be very different than probably what most people think they're doing. Lance Walker, who's the director of sports performance at the Michael Johnson Center in North Texas, him and I did a series years ago, and his title slide was "Traditional Weightlifting Inhibits Athletic Performance." And coaches and athletic trainers would look at that and they go, "Man, what is that?" And essentially, to summarize, really, these traditional powerlifting things that I did in high school and college when I competed really actually been shown in many cases to actually inhibit athletes, and worse, put athletes at risk for soft tissue injuries. And what do I mean by that? Well, everybody is familiar with a squat exercise, and I think that we see a lot of people, football players that do it, soccer players, etc. But if we build imbalance in those muscles, which often happens with inappropriate squats or too many squats, we build what we call a quad dominant athlete. So our muscles in the front of our thighs, our quads get big and strong. Meanwhile, our hamstrings in the back usually are neglected and they get overpowered. And so we put ourselves at risk for developing hamstring strains. And, that is one of the biggest things that we see. So that, could be prevented by appropriate training and adherence to good form, but also rethinking our off-season training. And so as we get ready, of course, for the season, just because, we did it, it doesn't mean that athletes need to do it. What I mean by that is, old habits die hard, and that a lot of coaches adhere to old training regimens. But I think that one of probably the most respected, coaches, sports performance trainers in football, is Fitness Quest 10 in San Diego, and they were the ones that trained Daniel Breeze. And if you look at activities as opposed to traditional weight training, so I think that we can talk about that. We can talk about, once we are appropriately training, warm up, making sure that we do dynamic warm ups. The old static stretches of cross one leg over, hang down for 10, 20 seconds, to cross over it. Static stretches really is kind of old school. And I think that we talk about warming up the muscles either through a light jog, or in some cases you'll see football players on the sidelines even riding a stationary bike. So you get the muscles warm and then go through what we call a dynamic stretching warm-up routine, which is certainly shown to be more effective. So those are some very basic things that we can do in order to decrease injuries and strains. But the other thing that we see is doing too much too soon. So of course in North Texas, and I wrote a book on this, talking about year-round youth sports being a prescription for disaster. And in that book, I talk about this very thing, that we have young athletes. Let's talk about, youth, and, raising 3 kids myself that were all athletes, 9 and 10-year-olds, let's say. We have in North Texas this, thought process of, what are you going to do the rest of your life when you're 9 and 10? What one sport are you going to do? So one of the things is, in my opinion, professionally and personally, avoiding sports specialization early on. And I highlight Bo Jackson in my book, and of course I'm old enough to have lived through the Bo Jackson era. And I think that the commercials in the 80s, and talking about Bo knows, and I think that's a great example, because it was about balance. It was about balanced training, kind of started the cross training phenomenon, and athletes participating in a multitude of sports as opposed to just one sport builds a more balanced athlete. It helps them to rest other joints, muscles, and really helps them to perform better, in my opinion, professionally, in all areas. And I think that a book called The Sports Gene, which was written several years ago, kind of talks about the genetic factors, but then also about the training as well. I think that there's a lot of things that we can do, but really what it requires is a paradigm shift. It requires us to change the space between our head, our brain, and just how we think about traditional training. And I found that that's one of the hardest things, that changing habits. So I think those are really some high-level things that we could think about, and that coaches, athletic trainers, and parents could think about in trying to prevent soft tissue injury.
We're talking with Dr. Robert Berry, orthopedic surgeon with Baylor Scott and White Medical in Plano, and the medical director of sports medicine here on DCTF Live. Get involved in the conversation at #DCTF Live. Doc, I want to ask you one more question before we let you go. I know you're busy doing important stuff, more important stuff than talking to us bozos. Want to ask you, we do have a lot of high school football coaches, watching, and maybe high school athletes themselves. With particular to young athletes, what are maybe the biggest mistakes you see that young athletes make when it comes to taking care of their bodies?
Yeah, great question. I think that one of the biggest things, this is saying very obvious, is not getting enough sleep and giving ourself a chance to recover. I think that especially young athletes, high school, junior high, where kids are going to early sports training programs early on in the day, then class and practice at night, and really aren't getting enough sleep. There was a study done a couple years ago, and it really was focused on baseball players and about performance linked to sleep deprivation. And again, kind of like a bank account, that when it gets deprived and when you make a lot of withdrawals, that then you got to make deposits. And so young athletes that don't get enough sleep, time, rest to recover, is going to inhibit their ability to get the best benefits from their workout. So I think getting enough sleep is certainly important. And I think, as I said earlier, doing too much too soon and not necessarily following appropriate training regimen. So think outside the box. Traditional weightlifting is not necessarily the way to go. One size does not fit all. So if you're a lineman versus a defensive back versus a quarterback, your workouts and your training regimen should probably be different. So think about that, and that the one size doesn't fit all for training.
He is Dr. Robert Berry, orthopedic surgeon with Baylor Scott and White Medical in Plano and the medical director of sports medicine. Doc, appreciate your time and your insights, and best of luck down the road.
Absolutely. It was great visiting with you guys today, and all the best.